Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Faerie Knight by David Niemitz. Narrated by Richard Trinder. Chapter 1. Into the Woods. It is tempting to think that, with the benefit of hindsight, we can point at clear signs of the coming cataclysm. The truth, however, is that by all accounts Decimus Avitus led a thoroughly unremarkable life for the son of an Etelan emperor, and that prior to the arrival of Samael the Sun-Eater, there was no reason to think he would ever rise higher than his post as provincial governor, or indeed do much of historical note at all. François de Lutetia, A History of Narvonne. 19th day of the planting moon, 297 AC. When Trist had nearly reached the end of the woodcutters' paths, not far outside of where the edge of the village was marked by a stockade of dark yerbara wood, he reined Cazador to a halt and dismounted. The steel rings of his chainmail rustled, and he readjusted his broad leather sword belt to settle it on his hips comfortably. Rather than tie the grey destrier to a convenient branch, Trist pulled a carrot from his saddlebag. Kaz snuffed over his hand, accepted the offered treat, and happily munched away. Trist took a few more things out, 2 unlit torches which he thrust through his belt, a wineskin, and a sack with a slice of cold roast boar, a wedge of cheese, and a loaf of last evening's bread from the kitchens of Foyer Chaleureux. He checked the newly forged dagger in his boot to be certain it was still there, and then turned back to the destrier. "Good boy," Trist murmured, cupping the horse's head with his left hand and leaning his own forehead down against the white blaze that stood out from Cazador's otherwise grey coat. "Don't wait for me," he said after a moment, then stepped away and raised his voice. "Go home, Kaz!" He turned into the forest, ignoring the whinny from behind him, and set off through the Ardenwood for the chapel of Saint Camiel. He knew the way. He had walked it since childhood. 7th day of the flower moon, 285 AC. Trist du Cameret à Ardent didn't have a destination in mind when he fled the manor. He only wanted to get away from his tutor, Brother Alberic, before the old monk could switch his knuckles raw again. Mother would never have let the old man hurt him if she was still alive. "It isn't fair," Trist grumbled to himself, sprinting down the beaten dirt track to the forest, away from the centre of the village, the river, or the fields to the south. Even Percy had yelled at him, finally, in frustration, when Trist had knocked over a pot of ink with his elbow. Trist's half-brother, elder by just over 2 years and their father's heir, was usually his protector, the one who stepped in when Trist was in trouble, but this time the ink had spilled on Percy's parchment of old Etelan translations, and even he'd had enough. Trist ducked off the path when he heard the woodcutters singing their tree songs up ahead in the distance, the thunk of their blessed axes, and their occasional shouts to each other in the cool morning. To the west, a carefully tended yerbara grove provided the village's most prized crop, a fine black wood, nearly as strong as steel, used to create longbows of incredible power, stringed instruments that sounded more truly than any other wood, and a dozen more goods besides. He jumped a fallen tree as he moved away from the woodsmen and the grove, cut around a patch of blooming sweetbriars, and followed the gentle sound of flowing water until he came out of the undergrowth to a broad, shallow stream, rippling over pebbles and around rocks. It must flow into the rear, Trist decided, talking out loud to himself, another habit that Brother Alberic and his parents deplored. He sat down on the mossy bank, removed his boots, then his wool socks, and dipped a foot into the water, finding it cold. He was just selecting a good rock for skipping when the wind carried the sound of someone humming to him. "Hello," Trist called, and, forgetting his boots on the bank, picked his way upstream. He climbed a small series of cascades among the wet rocks until he came to a golden pool, sandy beneath the water, where a break in the green canopy overhead let fall a shaft of sunlight. A slim girl, perhaps 10 years or so of age, like him, was standing in the pool in a white linen shift, singing softly to herself. "Oh, do not tell the priest our plight, for he would call it a sin. I've been with my love in the woods all night, conjuring summer in. Now is the sun come up from the south, with oak and ash and thorn. Sing oak and ash and thorn, my love, all of a midsummer morn. Surely we sing no little thing in oak and ash and thorn." The falling sun lit up her pale hair like fine strands of fire. Her shadow danced on the rippling water, and Trist stumbled, his foot coming down heavily with a loud splash as he caught his balance. The girl gave a cry of fright, eyes wide as she saw him, frozen in the moment like a deer startled by the hunters. Trist knew that she would run. "Wait!" he called, holding up his hands. "I won't hurt you. I just heard you singing, and wanted to see who it was. I haven't seen you in the village before." She trembled there, hesitant. "I'm not from the village," she said softly. "My name is Trist." He introduced himself, but didn't dare bow. He felt, somehow, that he had trapped her eyes with his, and the moment he broke the connection, there would be nothing holding the girl here. "Trist du cabaret à Ardent," he swallowed. "You don't need to be afraid. This is my father's land. I won't let anyone harm you." Something flickered through her eyes at his name, too fast for him to judge what it meant. "Call me Lynette," she said. "What were you singing?" Trist relaxed a bit. She seemed to be calming. "An old song," Lynette said after a moment. "A tree song." "It was pretty," he said. "Teach it to me." Lynette nodded, and they sat on the bank, bare feet in the brook, until he'd learned the words and the tune, while she wove roses from the sweetbriars into his nut-brown hair. 19th day of the planting moon, 297 AC. Trist had expected that something would bar his way, but that it was a knight all armoured in thorns was a surprise. "Let me pass," he said grimly, but the wood-helmed knight gave no response, and Trist could not see his face. His armour was all of a pale green, almost faded to grey, in large thick plates of bark. Sharp thorns extended from his pauldrons an inch or more, from his cuirass and greaves and everywhere that Trist could see. His shield was blazoned with the pink rose of the sweetbriar, and his sword was serrated, beginning a hand-span below the tip. If drawn across his bare flesh, Trist expected it to leave horrific wounds. He was thankful he wore a shirt of good mail over his padded gambeson, with steel pauldrons and vambraces over that. Trist stepped left, and the Knight of Thorns mirrored him. 2 steps to the right, and the knight moved again. He pulled the unlit torches from his belt and dropped them, and then the sack of food. He had no shield to match, but his blade had the better reach. "I have business with Lynette du Chapelle du Camiel," Trist said formally. The Knight of Thorns raised his shield and set the tip of his blade in line with Trist's chest. Trist's longsword slid free of its leather sheath with a sigh, 36 inches of well-kept steel. He raised it to his right ear, both hands on the hilt, blade parallel with the ground, tip aimed at the chest of the Thorn Knight. Ox. John Granger, his master-at-arms, had always said that Trist favoured the guard too much, but for all that, Percy could only rarely break it. For a moment, all the sounds in the forest died away, save for the soft babble of water over stone somewhere just past the night from the brook that ran into the rear. The twin shadows cast by the 2 knights leaned toward each other, barely restrained. Trist pushed off with his back foot, more clumsily than in the practice yard, his blade coming around in a diagonal cut, down and from right to left. The Knight of Thorns raised his shield to take it, and stabbed with his shorter arming sword. Trist smiled. His enemy had taken the feint. He hadn't been certain it would work. Instead of remaining committed to the cut, which would never have pierced plate in any event, Tristan kept moving forward, spun tight counterclockwise around the shield, keeping it between him and the arming sword, planted his right foot inside the knight's left, and shoved him hard from behind. The Knight of Thorns stumbled, falling forward, and Trist quickly switched grips, holding his sword by the lower blade, and swung the crossguard above the hilt into the Thorn Knight's helm like a war-hammer. The metal crossguard punched through the helm like an axe through rotten wood. Trist wrenched it out, then swung a second time, then a third. By that point, the knight had stopped moving. The Thorn Knight's armour began to fall apart, twisted vines unravelling like threads. No longer tightly pressed together into plate, they curled up, stretching for sunlight, and green leaves sprouted all along their length. It was as if Trist watched winter pass through spring and into summer in the space of a moment. Where a knight had sprawled on the ground, defeated, a patch of sweet briars now blossomed, the roses delicate and pink. Blood rushing in his ears, Trist looked at them once, then sheathed his sword and sat down to catch his breath. It was the first time he'd ever been in a real fight with live steel. Once his heart slowed, he picked up the things he'd set aside and made his way through the wood to the brook where he'd met Lynette du Chapelle de Camiel 12 years ago. 18th day of the harvest moon, 287 AC. "You really live here?" They were 13 now, and after a day of dancing and cider at the harvest festival, Lynette had finally agreed to take him to where she lived with her mother. Trist had a sack full of turnips, bread, a wheel of cheese, and salted dried meat, all slung over his shoulder. He'd made a habit of bringing Lynette and her mother food for years now, from the manor's kitchens. He also carried a knife in a sheath on his belt, though he would have wished for a sword instead. Not that there was any danger so close to the village, not like in the depths of the haunted Ardenwood. Still, he liked the feel of a sword at his hip. It seemed to be the one thing he was good at, or at least the one thing he could do better than Percy. "I do." Lynette nodded, reaching out her pale hand, and Trist took it. The briar roses were still in her hair from when she'd met him at the edge of town in the morning, just as the monastery bells were ringing terse. She tugged him along up the worn stone steps, beneath a canopy of oak and ash boughs, and his boots rustled through the dry autumn leaves as he followed her up the path. There was a stone arch, and the foundations of crumbling walls running away from it to either side, covered in moss. Beneath the green he could make out faded carvings of the Angelus Saint Camiel, sacrificing himself against the Sun-Eater. Past the arch, Lynette led him to a small chapel on top of the hill, rectangular in shape, built of regular stone blocks. They were mossy, too, and discoloured by long exposure to the elements. The door had long since rotted away, and the roof as well, and a great oak tree had grown up from the floor, spreading its branches over the structure. The oak retained most of its leaves, with the effect that the chapel was roofed in bright autumn scarlet. "But there's no actual roof," Trist protested, their voices echoing around the inside of the chapel. "How do you keep warm in winter?" "The cellar," Lynette said, motioning to a stair in the corner that descended down into the earth beneath the chapel. "You can leave the food at the top of the stairs," she suggested, and Trist set the burlap sack down. "I wish you would come live in the village," he said again. "My father would take your mother on as a servant if I asked." Lynette shook her head, as she always did when he said this. "We like the forest. There's too many people and too much fuss in town. We're quite happy here, though I did like the dancing." "I worry about you," he admitted, "especially in the winter." "Oh, Trist," Lynette said fondly. "You don't need to worry about me." Suddenly she leaned into him, flighty as a bird, and brushed her lips against his cheek. "I've shown you where I live. Now go, before my mother gets back." He did as she asked, as if asleep, and hardly knew where she was until he'd crossed the brook again and was nearly back to the village, only pausing once when he heard an old woman's sharp voice from the ruined chapel. "Where have you been, girl?" her mother said. The thought of fleeing Lynette's mother displeased Trist, but he knew she was old enough to be betrothed now, if not married quite yet, and he didn't want to ruin her reputation. Trist grinned as he stepped back onto the beaten earth of the woodcutter's road. He was thinking of Lynette as if she were a lady, the daughter of a knight or a baron, when she was a peasant girl with no father, living in the woods. He doubted anyone else in the village would say she had much of a reputation to ruin in the first place, but he still wanted to protect her. His birthday was High Summer Day in less than a year. After that, he would be 14 years old, and that would be old enough. He was the second son and would never inherit land, no matter what. He could support Percy just as well with a peasant girl for a wife as with some western knight's third daughter. When he was 14, Trist decided he would ask his father's permission to marry Lynette. His fingers rose to touch his cheek where she'd pressed a fleeting kiss, and Trist hurried home. Chapter 2. The Labyrinth. The Angelus our prayers implore, heralds of glory evermore, Angelus of all grace and might, to banish sin from our delight, our mind be in their keeping placed, our body true to them and chaste, where only faith her fire shall feed to burn the weeds of demon seed. Narvonian Hymn, early 2nd century A.C. 19th day of the planting moon, 297 A.C. As a child, Trist had hopped from stone to stone when crossing the brook where he'd first met Lynette. Now, armoured in chain, long sword sheathed once again, he tromped through, careful of his footing, relying on the oiled leather of his riding boots to keep out the water. Once he'd reached the far bank, he set off up the familiar game path that led to the hill upon which the ruins of the Chapelle de Camiel rested. When he came upon the worn stair, however, and the mossy stone arch above it, Trist did not see crumbling stones tumbled off to either side. Instead, the walls looked as if they had been built yesterday, the granite smooth and well-fitted, stretching out to surround the chapel in both directions. Placing his left hand on the pommel of his sword, Trist strode up the steps and passed beneath the arch. Before him stretched another stone wall, parallel to the walls leading out from the arch itself, creating a sort of outdoor hallway or corridor, open to the blue sky above, but paved with broad, flat stones beneath Trist's boots. He looked up, measuring the walls, and guessed them to be at least 10 feet in height, and too smooth to climb easily, especially armoured. To the left, then, as one direction seemed as good as another. The walls curved, and he tried to imagine how, from above, they would form a circular fortification around the chapel. His father would have loved stone walls like this. The curve had taken him out of sight of the arch when Trist came to the first branching. The wall opened to his right, leading into another curving corridor. Or he could continue on the outside ring. "It is a labyrinth," Trist realized, with a sigh. 13th day of the new summer's moon, 288 A.C. The great hall of Sir Rience du Cameret à Ardon's manor, foyer chaleureux, was filled to the brim with relations and guests. His old friend and battle companion, Tor de Lancy, a gregarious man with a red face and a great belly that Trist guessed must have grown since the stories of their youth as squires, had brought his wife, Jeannette, and their daughter. 3 great banners hung this evening, one with the black yebara tree sprinkled with white flowers on a field of green, the heraldry of Trist's own family, and another, a red war-hammer on white, shaped just like the weapon hanging at Sir Tor's belt when he'd rode into the courtyard. The last was the white seashell on blue of their mutual liege, Baron Urien. Percy and Trist's older cousin, Sir Lucan, had come, newly knighted and soon to be wed, escorting the young Lady Claraison, who was to be Percy's wife, all the way from Rocher de la Garde on the sea, where Trist dimly recalled spending a single golden summer. The family's master-of-arms, John Granger, sat near the foot of the table, his hard eyes scanning the room as fiercely as he watched Trist and Percy in the practice yard. Brother Alberic sat next to Brother Hugh, the abbot, deeply involved in a discussion of theology. Trist had caught just enough out of the corner of one ear to come to his own conclusions about how interesting the subject matter was, and the answer was not at all. And while they were commoners, not nobles, Sir Rience had invited many of the more important people in the village as well. James Miller, whose father and grandfather before him had run the lumber mill fed by the woodsman, for instance. His family had mastered the songs for the working of the yebara wood cut from the grove. William Chapman and his wife Anne were the most prosperous merchants in town, enough so that they'd rebuilt their shop in the market just 2 winters past to be 2 stories tall. The only person missing was his mother, but Trist put that thought aside firmly. Trist took a long drink of watered wine. Building the bone fires with the other young men had been long work, especially with, the help of the younger boys of the village, who were more interested in playing with the fires and running around shrieking with smoking brands. He didn't know whether the bone fires actually kept dragons, witches, and fairies away, but it was a Midsummer's Eve tradition, and he couldn't remember a year when he hadn't been running around on the errand the night before his birthday. He was 14 tomorrow, on the feast day of Saint Madiel, and he now wore an arming sword on his hip, though he would have preferred something longer. Trist had come more and more to prefer a blade he could wield with both hands, though Percy told him he was a fool to give up a shield. Of course, Percy could hardly beat him 1 time in 3 now.
And angelica root, wild celery? That's good for aches and pains when you get older.
Enid Delancey went on, seated to his right. She was younger than him, though Trist forgot by how many years, a wisp of a girl with brown hair and a quiet voice he had to strain to hear over the sounds of the feast. The current course was tarte du char, a pork pie containing currants, dates, raisins, and pine nuts, spiced with pepper and ginger, and all mixed with honey. It was one of Trist's favourites, though Enid didn't seem to be eating much of it. In fact, while she'd moved her fork around a bit, he wasn't sure she'd actually swallowed any. "I wonder if Brother Hugh is aware," Trist said courteously. "It might be good to grow a crop in the Abbey herb garden for the older brothers. How do you like the pork pie, Lady Enid? It's one of my favourites." Enid looked down at her plate.
"I don't usually eat meat,"
she admitted, in a voice that was barely audible. Trist opened his mouth to ask why ever not, but thought better of it. A knight was courteous. "Well," he said after scraping his mind for a moment, "you might prefer the mushroom and cheese pie in that case. I'm not certain what course it will be, but I helped gather the mushrooms yesterday. They grow on the oaks around here, and they taste a bit like lemon chicken." The younger girl brightened, giving up on moving pieces of pork around, now that she'd been honest with him.
"Yes, that sounds wonderful. That sounds like chicken of the woods. There are a few that look much like it, but are poisonous."
"Don't worry, I had expert help," Trist assured her. Lynette had helped him, and she knew every berry, nut, or mushroom that could be eaten in the Ardenwood. She had to, or she and her mother would have starved long ago. Trist's eyes flicked to his father, Sir Rience, at the head of the table, dignified in his white beard. Perhaps between the courses Trist could find an excuse to sneak over and speak to him. He'd practised the words in his mind, and even out loud in the privacy of the Ardenwood, 1,000 times over. How he'd admit Lynette was not of noble birth, but describe her beauty, her intelligence, her loyalty.
"Glad you're so kind,"
Enid said, and Trist realized he had no idea what had come before.
"Father said you would be, but you never know until you actually meet someone. But now I see I had nothing to be frightened of."
Trist smiled politely. The footmen were coming in to clear the course. "Of course. You are absolutely safe here. Would you excuse me for just a moment? I need to speak to my father about something." He rose even before the girl had responded, and threaded a path carefully up to the head of the table, where he greeted his father.
"Ah, Trist."
His father reached out an arm and wrapped it around Trist's shoulders, pulling him down and in for a loose, one-armed embrace. Down the sides of the table, to the left and the right, Sir Tor and his wife, Percy and Lady Clarison, and everyone else who'd been seated near the head of the feast table, greeted him with smiles and raised glasses.
14 years old tomorrow. I remember when you were small enough I could hold you in the crook of one arm."
Trist blushed. "You've told me, father," he said, and waited till nearly everyone had turned back to their conversations before lowering his voice. "I had hoped to speak to you, actually, now that I'm old enough to be betrothed." Sir Rience leaned in and lowered his voice.
"Sharp boy. Figured it out, eh? What do you think of her?"
Trist's mind caught like a wagon wheel in the mud. "Think of her?"
"Little Enid de Lancey. She'll make a good wife for you. Best to give it a few years, let you both grow up like we're doing with your brother."
The older man motioned with his goblet to where Percy and Clarissant were sitting side by side, speaking with their heads close together. Percy was 16, but his betrothed a year younger.
"But she's kind, and that's a good thing in a mother. Tor says she's crazy about plants, which is a bit odd, I'll grant you, but harmless."
"I wasn't going to ask you about Enid de Lancey," Trist finally blurted out. His father frowned, but he went on anyway. "There's a girl who lives just outside the village. Her name is Lynette."
"Who's her father?"
Rience du Cameret à Ardon asked gruffly, narrowing his eyes. "Her father's long dead," Trist said, "and she cares for her mother, which shows her loyalty, father. They aren't wealthy, I know, but I am only the second son. Percy's your heir. I care for her, father, and I want to ask your permission."
"Angelus above, tell me you haven't already put a baby in her belly."
Trist just about choked. He'd never had more than a dance and a kiss on the cheek from Lynette. Not that he hadn't thought about more. He shook his head, and his father let out a sigh of relief, leaning back in his chair.
"Good. You're not to see her again,"
Sir Rience ordered, with a decisive chop of his hand.
"A dalliance with a peasant girl can be overlooked so long as nothing comes of it, but your future wife won't like it if she finds out, so best to end it now."
"I don't want to wed Enid de Lancey," Trist protested. "She seems nice enough, but I don't love her. I barely know her." His father grabbed him by his linen shirt and pulled him in close.
"You will not refuse the daughter of a knight, of one of my oldest friends, a young woman of good breeding and quality, for some ragged peasant girl living in the woods. Now that's the end of it. The betrothal will be announced tomorrow, so go get to know the girl and be kind to her. I should have put a stop to you sneaking off into the Ardenwood years ago. It's dangerous. We lose woodcutters every few years, and the merchant wagons have it even worse. By all that's holy, boy, the Bissets lost a child there just this past winter. You're to stay out of it from now on. Focus on your training with John."
Trist opened his mouth to protest again, but Sir Rience clenched his fist, balling up the linen fabric and pulled.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?